The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jana Martella, and I am the co-director of the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes, and you are at our final roundtable preliminary webinar. So thank you for attending. We're going to give folks just another minute or two before we actually start the broadcast with all of our presenters, just so that we can give everyone ample time to log on. For my presenters, though, for the moment, if you guys would mute your microphones or telephones, and then I'll tell you when we're going to get going. Okay? Okay, I think we will get going. Good afternoon again, everyone. This is Jana Martella, and you are in Roundtable webinar. In this case, the Advancing the Workforce, teaching birth through third grade, teaching children birth through age 8. This is a pre-conference webinar for our upcoming meeting in Austin, starting next week on Wednesday in Austin, Texas, the 2018 Roundtable pre-conference webinars. So just as a reminder, the webinar is going to be recorded, and in fact, you can find the previous 3 webinars on the Roundtable website under the tabs for preliminary web conferences. You'll see this recording there shortly after our meeting closes together. I wanted to give you a little tour of your dashboard. Because of the number of folks who are aboard, we're expecting 30 to 40 people. All questions should be submitted, or comments as well, in the question box in your dashboard. We'd actually ask you to use your chat box if you're having technical difficulties, and we'll try to troubleshoot those from the chat box. But questions and comments, please submit to our presenters in the webinar dashboard question box. So today's agenda, really quickly, it's pretty exciting. I think I have mentioned that this webinar is a component part of the 2018 Roundtable taking place next week in Austin, Texas. The Roundtable gathers 130, 140 individuals from around the country, mostly state specialists from their state offices of early learning throughout the country, but also some associate members, previous state agency leaders, and some national organization leaders, and some from higher education as well. This year, there will be a cohort focus on 4 areas, and you can see the webinars for the 3 previous cohorts. So individual members at the Roundtable will be talking about the early childhood, early learning opportunities in the Every Student Succeeds Act. They'll also be talking about high quality instruction, ensuring an equitable foundation for all children, regardless of disability, assuring an equal opportunity for all of our kids. And then this final webinar focusing on advancing the workforce from birth through age 8. So today we're really excited to concentrate on a very intensive set of initiatives that emanated from the National Academies of Science. I'm sure you all are familiar with 2 specific studies that Albert will talk briefly about more, and largely the first study, which we all have been paying attention to. Certainly then Deb Adams, and we'll talk about a prospectus paper that was written by some national organizations. And then Linda Bray and Susan Sarver from Nebraska are going to tell us a little bit about the implementation work that Nebraska conducted under some initiatives forwarded by the national academies as well. And then finally, we will be given a tour of New America's guidebook on the workforce study. So it's going to be a great opportunity to get expertise from Laura Bornfreund and Abby Lee Berman. So Albert, you are first up. If you could unmute yourself, and I'm sure that all of us have a few questions for you, but I, in particular, you don't have to explain the entire transforming the workforce. I know that the report itself, many of us have wandered through the 13 recommendations, certainly all of the wonderful graphics that came from the study, and as well as the content and the 13 recommendations. I'm very curious to get your perspective as a panelist. Like, what was, can you explain what life is like for a panelist under a big project like that? And maybe a little bit about what was really eye-opening for you, or challenging, or inspiring.
Okay. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon, or I think everybody's in the afternoon, maybe. So just to kind of answer your question briefly about sort of what it was like to be on the committee. I mean, it was a pretty big committee, and it is a very interdisciplinary committee, and a theme that I might come back to a little later. And you know, first it was just a privilege to be in a room for that extended period of time with some of the smartest people in the field, really. But I think, you know, there was a kind of a divide and conquer kind of approach. We you know, brought different things to the table, and there were, for example, you know, a number of neurobiologists who basically briefed us on like the latest state-of-the-art science behind early childhood development and brain development. And, you know, they both verbally and then also in writing. And so there was a lot of, for us who are not in that world and not without that expertise, we, you know, did our best to absorb the information. And then really sort of thought about how that, for the folks like me who were sort of more on the policy side of things, felt, you know, that really helped inform, you know, what the policy implications are for the workforce. And so, yeah, so there was a lot of divide and conquering. So people would take different pieces, and you know, in terms of writing of it, you know, I did a fair amount of writing on some of the policy issues. Again, but it was helpful to have some of the science as background, right? So that when I'm writing, I can refer back to, you know, what people, you know, what some of the scientists have contributed. And yeah, and then the in terms of deliberations for the conclusions and recommendations, that was definitely done jointly, and like it is a consensus study, so we had to reach consensus, and there was, you know, we didn't always start with in the same place, and you know, obviously with support from the staff at the national academies, we were able to land on the 13 recommendations that we did. So maybe I'll stop, and I can say a few more words about like what's inspiring, what's challenging, what eye-opening. Do you want me to go into that, or do you want to follow?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I think it would be great if you would do that, Albert. And if questions come up while you're you know, informing us, we'll pass those along to you. But
okay,
keep going.
Okay, I'll start with what's inspiring. I think, I mean, we kind of know this already, but I think what's inspiring is that I think all of us have the science on our side. You know, that it's just the evidence around early learning and early child development and what it takes to maximize the potential in young children before well, this is a birth to age 8, report, but before school, before formal schooling, so to speak, it's just immense, and it's and the science continues to kind of show that we are doing the right work, or just to put it simply, and that the professionals who work with young children, need to be well trained, well supported, and well compensated. So that was kind of the first thing I thought of when I was thinking about what to say here. The other is, in terms of a challenge, is just that, that said, the science, in terms of the child development is strong. In terms of the implementation of programs and practices, there's not a lot of definitive research on a lot of things that we were supposed to provide some recommendations around. And so what we ended up doing was doing a lot of thinking about what's the emerging consensus, what can we, as a committee, kind of stand behind based on some research, but also based on the policy realities of the field, and what what implementation, what it will take to implement a recommendation, or what recommendation will, how it would play out in the the marketplace that we have, in the policy realities that we operate within. So that was a challenge, definitely a challenge. And then in terms of an eye opener, this gets back to interdisciplinary aspect of what I was saying before. Again, not that I was surprised by it, but it was striking how often this notion of needing to work in an interdisciplinary way really kind of that theme kind of recurred over and over again. Whether it's the research in terms of needing to look at child development not only from the neurobiological kind of like aspect of it, but also in terms of obviously child development, psychology, language development, math, early math, research on early math and social emotional development and all of that. And then of course the research on adult learning when it comes to the professionals. So all of that, but also even in the higher ed space, when we talk about professional development and professional learning, sort of the importance of approaching it from an interdisciplinary way in terms of not just definitely grounded in child development and the science of child development, but also content knowledge and pedagogy. All those three things need to work hand in hand, and they're often in different sort of disciplines. And so how do you combine those disciplines into a coherent kind of experience for professionals who are getting trained and supported to do this work? And then I think finally in policy and practice implementation, there was one of the things that we did is go out into the field and like talk to people, professionals who are doing the work. And again, a recurring theme was for early child professionals to say, or education professionals to say, it's fine that I know what to do and I feel competent, but I still need to know how to how to kind of navigate social services systems that social workers or nurses or other fields that also support the the learning and development of young children, and that this is really an interdisciplinary kind of practice. Not that one person has to know everything, but they, the professionals have to know how to engage with other disciplines and fields so that they can collaborate and bring other resources to the table when serving young children and families. So, so that theme of interdisciplinary, having that approach was interesting how it came, to me, that how it came up over and over again.
So I'm curious, the prompt on the slide, of course, includes the transforming the financing for the workforce in early education. And we know that dollars are often cited as the degree recommendations that you all made, kind of hand in glove as the overriding challenge for the field. And so I'm wondering if you have had some reflections, and I know that you were in last week's day-long meeting on the financing report, some reflections on the connections, how these reports really did need to accompany one another, and reflections on the receipt of either of these in the field. You know, how has it gone since Transforming the Workforce was released? Were there some surprise responses, positive or negative? And, you know, how have the panelists and others leapt over or held hands with those positive, you know, leapt over the challenges or held hands with the positive responses?
So I'll start by, in terms of answering that question, I will start by saying that, as people might have heard before, the Committee for the Transforming the Workforce report, the first report, was told explicitly that we should not consider financial kind of implications or realities, that the study sponsors didn't want the committee to be kind of constrained by, oh, we will never be able to afford this, or, oh, where would the money come from? You know, those sorts of conversations. So I think that was helpful in terms of disconnecting those two things, so that, again, the committee can be somewhat idealistic, if you want to put it that way, about the recommendations. That said, I think some of the sponsors of both reports are the same people, and I think that there was intention to say, okay, the next step then is to think about how to pay for this and how much this costs and how to pay for it. So I do think that these two reports do go hand in hand, and I think the similarity in covers in the cover art is not accidental. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm pretty sure it's not accidental. So I think, so my reflections on the Transforming the Finance report, I think one is just that we all know that that we can operate within the funding streams that we have and that only gets us so far. And some of the, one of the things I've said in other places is that we can only, blend and braid so much until, there comes a point where, we just need to fund these programs and support the professionals in a more robust way, and that means additional revenue. So I think the Transforming the Finance report definitely signals that and conveys that pretty clearly. But not, still kind of, emphasizing the need to use existing resources sufficiently, but at the end of the day, it's also about new resources, and I think it gives the field a maybe license to sort of talk about the cost of quality without sounding like completely, completely out of, completely unreasonable to people, and to really just sort of stand by a number and not even say that this is a high cost or this is a big number. This is just what it costs for quality, and we need to live up to that and face that. So I think that's a helpful kind of a very high level, a helpful kind of contribution to the conversation. So yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of surprises in terms of these reports coming out and what I've seen. I mean, I am inspired by the amount of activity that, at least, the financing report is a little early, but still early in the early stages, having been released like maybe a month or two ago. It is heartening to see the Transforming the Workforce report kind of leading, causing a lot of activities in states, with funders getting more engaged in this issue, with state folks, whether it's inside government, outside government, picking up the workforce as an issue to focus on. And a lot of that has to do with the financing, and particularly compensation has been, I'm sure everybody is aware of, has been a big, push in the field, which I think it's progress. I mean, I can't say that I've been in this field, that long compared to others, but I've been in long enough to sort of notice that, these are not new issues. We've been talking about these issues for a long time. I feel like people have come to a point where we just can't talk about it anymore. We need to do something. And so I think both of these reports, I think that's happening, and I think the financing report will continue to kind of build on that momentum on the Transformative Workforce report.
So thank you. We did get one question, which I think you have somewhat addressed, Albert, in asking. The subtitle of the workforce report itself is a unifying foundation, and you did let us know, correct me if I'm wrong, that it was, since it's a consensus report, the 13 recommendations were agreed to by all panelists before it was finally published. That's right, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And I don't know that I have the formal definition of what consensus meant in this committee. It's been a while, but as we all know, consensus doesn't necessarily mean like everybody is like, there's a different degrees of consensus. So I think it is a consensus of the committee to have to have these recommendations.
So I think you also indicated that it's your sense, and I think I would agree, and I'm going to call on our fellow cohort planners in a minute to pose any additional questions or comments. But I do have a sense, despite the fact that it was kind of laying a line in the sand, that there is a general consensus in the field to at least put a foot forward on a change process that will get to the 13 recommendations. I have sensed that, and that has been a bit of a surprise for me. And I think that is a good lead-in for Deb in a minute. But before we do that, I'm wondering, on the line and with their phones open, are Linda Bray, who from Nebraska, who will be addressing some of the Nebraska work in a moment. Also, Jim Squires from NEAR is one of the workforce cohort leads for us in Austin. And then Deb Adams, we're going to ask you a bunch of questions about the consensus report in a minute. But I'm wondering if any of you have a comment or a question for Albert as an inside scoop on this, big paper that has created a catalyst and perhaps a watershed for our field.
Hi, Albert. This is Jim Squires, and I'm wondering, given that our field of early care and education is broad, since this report has come out and recommendations, and we acknowledge that it is consensus-driven, are there particular sectors that have come out to take a strong stand either in favor of or opposing the recommendations? The reason I ask this is, again, because we partner with so many different cross or near sector groups. I think it's just useful to know where one another may stand on this.
Mm-hmm. So, I think the recommendation that has engendered the most kind of debate is probably the recommendation 2 around the degree requirement for lead teachers to have a 4-year degree, higher ed degree in with specialization in early child education. I think that I think that depending on who you talk to, I think the debate is about different things. One is people who have expressed concern about that recommendation. Sometimes their concern is about making sure that this is not being pushed on the professionals, that the professionals have some say about what they think the level of education and professional preparation and what those expectations need to be for the professionals. I think other voices that I've heard expressing some concerns about this recommendation are from folks who are not in in sectors within the field that for whom a bachelor's degree seems very sort of kind of pie in the sky. So by that I mean, like, there's family childcare professionals tend to have expressed some concerns about that more so than school-based pre-K teachers or infant toddler care providers tend to, have some concerns over, again, more so than, teachers or educators of older children, within the 0 to 8 continuum. And that's not to say that they don't think that a higher ed degree, a 4-year degree in early child education is valuable. And many of them are working towards that goal or have worked towards that goal. It's just that, again, the realities of the field, of the policy environment, gives people a lot of concerns, and I think that's very fair. And then, of course, there are the folks who, again, may not be like opposed to the recommendation per se, but they are very concerned about the diversity of the workforce and what this means for the diversity. And many of them would point to like the K-12 system, where you do have a 4-year degree requirement and teacher licensure requirements and all that, and really seeing over time decline in diversity, in at least racial diversity, in the teacher workforce in the K-12 system. So so maybe what I might sort of suggest is that the sort of concerns and critiques around that recommendation is maybe more about the implementation of it, more so than the idea of it. Now, having said that, I'm sure there are people, our field is vast and diverse, so I'm sure there are people who, doesn't think, really people need to have a bachelor's degree in early child education to be able to serve as a lead teacher, and that's part of the conversation. So maybe I'll stop there. Does that help, Jim?
So I think,
Thank you.
sure. So I think it's also a good lead-in to Deb, your presentation or discussion with us, because an outgrowth of the original Transforming the Workforce report was taking a unified foundation and gaining support from organizations for the 13 recommendations. So Albert was also a participant in that work, as were a number of the folks who are going to be speaking to you. So Deb, if you'd like to give us a little bit of an explanation of that work, and all of the documents that are displayed here are available online and will be included on the website following the panel. But Deb, how about a brief explanation of the Unified Foundation paper developed by multiple organization folks, including the Family Child Care Association?
Sure, yeah, thanks. And happy Tuesday, everybody. Terrific Tuesday. And I'll just have a really brief overview a bit. I was so pleased to actually be a part of this work and at the table with so many incredible people, because I think as a state specialist working in Connecticut presently, it was important to have a voice at the table that actually implements and creates policy and works around the nation in terms of trying to be closest to the ground, to the field. The majority of the participants in the work group, I would say, are from national organizations, entities, research, technical assistance providers, advocacy agencies. And so it was really a wonderful conversation with everybody about getting on some page to say, can we identify the problem and can we identify a solution? And I think that's an important part of the summary of the work, is sort of like this idea of consensus building. So we came together and we said, hey, yeah, there is a problem. And yeah, we got these great documents that are out. And what does the problem really mean, and how do we sort of solve it? So to me, this work was really about togetherness and commitment around all of these agencies and organizations that go out and help states and help advocacy work to implement great practice in the field. But it's the state specialists that, I'm going to use a really bad analogy, or like the Oreo cookie, where the fun stuff in the middle, and leadership changes. The outside cracker, the cookie, kind of changes every once in a while, but the stuff in the middle keeps continuing to work. And it's that marshmallow stuff in the middle that is a continuing effort. And so I saw this work as a level of commitment to support the continuing work in the states in some way. Some of the things that we did was to come up with a shared belief that drives the collective work and 7 principles of engagement. And in reading this over before the webinar, I sort of attached it to this idea of collective impact. And we think of collective impact coming up with a common agenda, which we did. We came up with a common agenda that we're all going to work together to build a unified foundation to move forward these recommendations and to agree that technical assistance will help support these recommendations in states. And an outgrowth of this effort has been the way that the National Academy of Sciences have worked with states and are currently working with states to come up with plans around the Transforming the Workforce report and the finance report. So I'll just run down the list real quick. California, Illinois, Washington State, Washington, Maryland, Northern Virginia as a regional team, Virginia State, Colorado, Minnesota, Nebraska, Indiana, and New York State. And they have some really great, robust plans. Some states are still working on their plans as part of this cohort work with the National Academy of Sciences. But I think there's some really great things in those plans that really get at what Albert was talking about in terms of those recommendations. How do states and how do the technical assistance providers that help states move through this work better collectively together? And it's not just about the agencies doing the work, it's about the partners in the field doing the work. How are we engaging our community networks, our neighborhoods, town and city government, the families, the teachers, the directors? How are we engaging everybody in this work so that it collectively can impact the children and families on the ground? And that's sort of like a really brief nutshell synopsis of some of the conversations that occurred and why we came together and wrote this brief prospectus just to kind of float out some of these ideas and to say that we're going to be better together and by working together.
So I also would really commend the prospectus paper to all of you. It's a preliminary reading in addition to this focus during our pre-conference webinar. It's short, it's pithy, and some of the remarkable components of it to me are the folks that signed aboard. Essentially, as a consensus group, we agreed to the 13 recommendations within the original report. One of them was to form a backbone or around which to put kind of the blood and guts and sinew and muscle behind the original report. And so over the course of 2 years, folks gathered. And in addition, who was at the table, I think is telling in that the bachelor's recommendation was probably the biggest lift within the 13 recommendations, but all who are signatories here, including folks from national organizations that you all know, and including the National Association for Family Child Care Providers and the Council for Recognition, the owners and developers of the CDA, kind of recognize that there are different pathways folks will take to that bachelor's degree, but they all put their thumbprint on the idea of getting there. So that was a remarkable feat in my mind. And in a minute, we'll hear from Linda and from Susan around the work that Deb mentioned regarding the implementation efforts in Nebraska. Each of the states that signed aboard the implementation effort did not take on all 13 recommendations. They chose target recommendations that they knew would be they could make progress toward quickly. So I think that might be it. Deb, I don't know if you have other things that you'd like to add, or if Laura or Abby or Albert have anything to add about the next steps for this organization. Mind you, power to the profession, decision cycles, not all of the decision cycles, but they've been through a lot of them and made a lot of progress, and that is parallel work with this. So if Abby, Laura, Albert, if you have anything else to say about the prospectus paper, please do so now, and if not, we'll move on to Nebraska.
All right, this is Linda from Nebraska, and I am really very pleased to introduce Susan Sarver. She's the Director of Workforce Planning and Development at the Buffett Institute, the University of Nebraska. Her work focuses on ensuring a skilled, informed, and diverse early child workforce, not only in Nebraska, but they are also looking at it across the entire nation. She's chair of the Nebraska team that's working with the National Academy of Medicine, and is involved with national efforts based on the recommendation from that recent consensus report. So Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. And she's also going to be in Texas, which just thrills me to death.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'm glad I can join everyone today and share a little bit of what we've been doing.
Okay, so one of my questions that I have is, what is one example of how the Commission is working to overcome challenges in Nebraska? I mean, we have many challenges. We have mobility issues facing the early childhood workforce, issues providing skills and tools for early childhood providers. We face low wages, lack of child care facilities to meet the needs of parents, and many other areas. So what is something that the Commission's doing to help overcome some of those areas?
Well, as Nebraska was participating in this kind of follow-up to the Institute of Medicine report and the Innovation to Incubation program, we pulled together a team of a lot of higher ed faculty, some some folks from Department of Education, and a couple of community-based folks and licensing representation. And we decided that really we wanted to focus on that competencies for the workforce as our starting place. So we chose kind of that first recommendation, that you need that unified foundation, you need some competencies. And that team came up with some specific recommendations around those. And while that team was working, the Buffett Institute pulled together a statewide commission to really kind of tackle, we're calling it transforming the workforce, to really kind of tackle the issues in the state. And we put together a blueprint based in part on some of the work that came out of the IOM report and some of the things we were seeing of all the different parts that needed to be in place to get what our goal is, the skilled, informed, and diverse workforce. So this blueprint, it starts with collaboration and engagement and getting the right people at the table. So what we've really been doing for the past year is pulling together a very diverse team of over 40 people from across the state to really talk about what's the goal and how are we going to get there. And what we're starting to do over the next year is to break into very specific work groups to really tackle some of those issues, like the funding issues, and what do we do about the fact that wages are so low for especially community-based providers in the state. You know, how do we tackle this recommendation of the bachelor's degree as the basis? Is that where Nebraska wants to go? And if so, how do we get there? Because at the Buffett Institute, you know, we have kind of our opinions on some of the recommendations, but we don't want to put that forward for the state. So we want this commission that we've pulled together to tell us, where does the state need to go? And then how can we as the Institute help this commission work together in a collective impact sort of way to move forward and tackle these issues in the state?
Thank you. And I wanted to add to, over a year ago, Build and CeLO worked with us to help us redo our professional core competencies for early childhood. And that's a document that we've been working on. Susan's been a part of that. Many people have been represented and been a part of that. And we are starting to get to the part where we will be working mainly just on the formatting and then sharing it statewide, getting feedback, and then making revisions. But Build and CeLO were actually key in helping us get that information done.
Yes.
So, Susan, what do you see as one of the main challenges facing the EC workforce in Nebraska?
Well, one of the things that's become very apparent as we pulled this commission together and as this group that initially started after the IOM report is that there is a lot of really great things going on in the state. And you wouldn't think that would be a challenge because there's so many great projects going on. But what has become apparent is they don't talk to each other as much as they should. So we'll have one really great project going on in a major city, but then something else will be happening in the rural parts of the state, and they don't talk to each other as much. And so I think that's one of my hopes that can come out of the commission and some of the other things we're doing to really say, hey, we've already got a lot here. Let's build on those and see what we can do with that, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
True. And communication is always so important. It just seems to be hard when you get it to this wide of a scale.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's really interesting in Nebraska. The team that we called it our NAM team, National Institute of Medicine team, we put together a series of strengths across the state. And one of the strengths that we said is that because we're a fairly small population state, a lot of the people in the early childhood field are on all the different committees and all the different initiatives. And so that really is a strength because we're already talking to each other and we get along and we can build on that. But there seems to be yet another step. We're on these same committees, so let's do some more coordination to help them all work together. So I think we've really got the basis there in Nebraska, especially because we are all already working together on so many things. It's just let's, push it a little harder.
That's great. Thank you both, Susan and Linda. Linda, did you have other questions for Susan? We have a couple questions that have come in through the question box, and I think because, in fact, they're very challenging and address everything we've discussed so far, including the recommendations from the original report combined with the recommendations that have come from what it actually will cost to implement those recommendations. But I wanted to give Nebraska ample time to tell us about your successes.
Well, it's like I said, I think we're just starting in some ways. I mean, we've got some things going on in the state, but I think we're really taking this whole process very seriously and deliberately, so that we are trying to move together as a state, and not just make quick decisions and decide, oh, we're going to spend money here and there, but really thoughtfully move forward so it's a sustainable effort.
I think that that's a perfect tee up for the New America Foundation's guidebook. The original report was, more than 600 pages. It's hard to parse out. These are recommendations that obviously are going to take time and intention to kind of move progress along. So we will return to the question about if we're going to be raising the education requirements, does this align with the compensation that ought to go along with that requirement? So be thinking of that, all of our panelists, and if we can, I think we'll move on to Laura and to Abby. And Abby, this means that I'm going to be, making you our presenter. This is a screenshot of the website, so we'll make sure that you all have that. And Abby, if you can take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Jana. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Abby Lee Berman, a policy analyst at New America. And
I'm Laura Bornfriend, director of the Early and Elementary Education Policy Team.
So we're excited to share a resource with you today that we hope will help you distill the vast amount of information put forth in the Transforming the Workforce report. So as you know, realizing the promises of high quality early education depends on a strong workforce. And thanks to advances in brain science, as Albert discussed, we understand now more than ever before just how important children's experiences during these early years are to their future success. And their learning and development depends on the positive interactions and secure relationships they form with caregivers and educators. So the National Academies puts forth a vision for shared knowledge and competencies for the workforce and lays out many principles for effective preparation, ongoing professional learning, and practice. The report calls for significant shifts to revamp how teachers, leaders, and other professionals working with children are prepared, credentialed, and supported. And as we've heard today, the recommendations, however, are complex and they'll take time to implement. And many different players are needed to make this vision a reality, including policymakers at the federal, state, and local level, institutes of higher education, other organizations that prepare educators and provide professional learning, and of course, the educators, program leaders, and other professionals working directly with young children. So each state, community, and program is starting at a different place, and without guidance, taking on this work can feel really overwhelming. So that's why in December, our team released this guidebook, which you can find on our website at www.newamerica.org. And this interactive space makes the key takeaways from the report more digestible and actionable. And we hope it will be a useful resource for anyone interested in strengthening the workforce and realizing the National Academy's vision. So if you scroll down this main page, you can see the contents of the guidebook, and we're just going to kind of walk through the guidebook with you today. So there's an introduction that explains the guidebook, frequently asked questions, summary of report chapters 3 through 11, followed by an overview of the report's recommendations or blueprint for action, including key takeaways for implementation. We have videos produced by New America, as well as videos from outside organizations, related resources from the National Academy of Medicine, New America, and other organizations, and tools such as interactive maps, comparing state policies, and questionnaires for determining where's the best place for your state to start. There's also a glossary of key terms, and then steps for 3 specific audiences, which those can also be accessed up at the top. So at the top of the main page, you'll see these 6 buttons, which will take you to different places in the guidebook. So the first 3 buttons are doorways for different but overlapping audiences that highlight the specific parts of the report most relevant to them and discussion questions to guide their thinking. So we have policymakers interested in improving early learning settings for children birth through age 8, the workforce or educators working directly with young children, and higher ed, so educators in higher education who are working to prepare and support the workforce. And then a shortcut to the 13 recommendations or blueprint for actions, to the videos, and then an option to start from the beginning. So today we'll select this and start from the beginning. So we start with a brief explanation of why we created the multimedia guidebook and introduce the report to anyone who's unfamiliar with it. And then in the bottom right corner, you can go to the next section, which is our frequently asked questions section. And the FAQ page is questions and answers that we've drawn from the first 2 chapters of the report. So this is a good place to start for readers new to this issue. We answer questions like who is in this workforce, why does it need to be transformed, some really great background information. And at the bottom, again, you can move on to the next section. So there's lots of frequently asked questions. And I'll let Laura step in.
Great, thank you, Abby. We've also included then, as Abby mentioned, summaries of report chapters 3 through 11, and each page follows a similar format with some key takeaways that we pulled out from the chapter, a brief summary, and when there's a need to provide some different kind of explanation, you'll see videos that are embedded in those pages. Some of the videos are produced by New America, others are borrowed from different organizations that specialize in specific topics, such as the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. At the end of every chapter summary, you'll see a button that says read the entire chapter, and that'll take you to the full report. And then you'll also see some key quotes and then specific discussion questions that are tailored for our 3 doorway audiences, policymakers, institutes of higher ed, and the workforce. And the format of each chapter, again, is similar. You'll see some graphics and some different things as you go through and from chapter to chapter. If you scroll then all the way to the bottom, you can also access the table of contents. We'll get there all the way. And then after each of the chapter summaries, so 3 through 11, we go to the blueprint for action. And the blueprint for action is really where the recommendations can be found. It alone spans about 77 pages. So we've kind of pulled the key information out of here, put forward the 13 recommendations along with a discussion of necessary considerations to better connect the research with policy and practice and ultimately improve outcomes for children. As state and local leaders, policy, research, and advocacy organizations, philanthropies, and the field itself work to put the blueprint for action into action. It's important to balance, the real sense of urgency for transformation with thoughtfulness and a realistic sense of the time it will take to bring meaningful and lasting change. So these recommendations can only be accomplished through long-term strategies coupled with short-term actions, and they should not be read as sequential. Every state and community is starting at a different point. And that's why you'll see this graphic sort of presented here like this instead of in an order. Really, you can choose your own starting point. So take higher education as an example. And this is considered recommendation 4 in the report, but it doesn't have to be accomplished after recommendation 3. Again, each state or program is starting in a different place. And then within the recommendations, when you go through, you'll see there's an overview, key quotes, and takeaways for implementation. The next resource that we have in the guidebook that we're excited to share is the video section. The table of contents also appears at the top, so you can select videos there or at the bottom. This collection of videos includes 5 produced by us, as well as videos from, again, outside organizations like Teachstone or Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. The videos can be watched on their own, but as we showed earlier, they're also embedded throughout the guidebook, to be viewed in context of the particular chapters that, we're using the videos to elevate. And in on this page, they're presented in the order that they appear in the guidebook. New America produced videos on 5 topics, and the topics that we felt that were highly important to elevate. First, we looked at how Omaha is building continuity from birth through 3rd grade. So continuity is one of the chapters in the Transforming the Workforce report. I believe it's chapter 5. We also produced a video on how an Oakland Early Learning Center engages and provides resources for families. We highlighted a P3 executive leadership program at the University of Washington that brings together principals and center directors. We went to Tulsa to explore a new bachelor's program in early childhood that meets the unique needs of this workforce. And we also highlighted a school in Oakland and focused on the issues of teacher well-being and the challenge of low compensation. And so we're going to just show you a quick clip of our Tulsa video today.
Okay, we're gonna go in the air. In the air. 1, 2, 3, 4. At the beginning of the chapter, it says that questioning comes very natural for young children, and so we should expect them to be asking, what's this?
Science has shown us how much young children are capable of. but it's incumbent upon the teacher to know how to organize and optimize child learning through having developmentally appropriate activities. So people who teach early childhood classrooms and do it well, and they know child development.
So our idea was that you guys would construct a map with all the different materials here. There are markers, pencils, crayons.
So the philosophy of our program is mainly focused on constructivist theory, creating curriculum around the children's interest. It's not just learning how to teach children to read or how to recognize the numbers and the letters. It's really dealing with comprehensive child development. So the cognitive child, the emotional child, the social child. And I think to do that and to do that well requires specialized knowledge and training.
And I think let's go ahead and cut it there, Abby. We just wanted you to get a little taste of the videos and hope that you find them both interesting and maybe even useful in your work. And I'll go ahead and turn that over to Abby again.
Thanks. So the next section, it has resources related to the early ed workforce. So this includes state implementation plans, like how we just heard about from the state of Nebraska. It also includes the other national academies reports, including the financing report, resources from New America, and resources from other organizations in the field who are doing related research. And then the next section, we've included a handful of tools that can help policymakers, education leaders, and other stakeholders determine where to get started and develop strategies for transforming the workforce. So we specifically want to draw attention to a tool created by New America with NAEYC that is geared towards state leaders. This extensive questionnaire can be used by state policymakers and advocates looking to transform the early ed workforce. It's intended to help people spot where opportunities, gaps, and blockages exist and where infrastructure is strong and weak, while also helping to establish paths for moving forward. So this is a questionnaire that we've been able to pilot in a few states. And after the tools section, you've got the glossary of key terms. So these terms are hyperlinked throughout the guidebook, and they're terms that we thought would be helpful to clarify complex concepts. And then finally,
and then this is Laura again.
Yes.
Abby is going to go to those three briefs that she mentioned at the beginning that are for the workforce, higher education, and policymakers. Each brief is geared for these audiences, sort of pulls out some key takeaways from the report for those audiences, and then at the bottom of each brief has the questions that can also be found at the bottom of each chapter, but has the questions that are for the specific audiences. And since many of you have a role in influencing policy, whether as an advocate or for a state agency, we'll give a quick overview for this one, the steps for policymakers. We started with the introduction, explaining that this section is intended for anyone at the federal, state, or local level who aims to ensure that educators and other adults who care for young children have opportunities and incentives to improve the quality of their work. Many of the existing policies threaten the quality of the workforce, but good policy can address the systemic barriers. We then draw the information from each chapter again that's most relevant to the audience and have those questions at the very bottom, which you can see right there. And if your time is limited or you want to introduce this topic to policymakers who don't have expertise in this area, this section of the guidebook is probably the most helpful. And then, all right. So we intend for this to be a living project and welcome your feedback. As you come across resources or tools that would be helpful for the field that's connected to this work, please let us know. We're happy to take a look and include them. We're happy to answer questions about the guidebook if you have any, but first we wanted to share a little bit about a blog series that we started earlier this year and will be running through the beginning of 2019. So some of you may have come across our series, Moving Beyond False Choices for Early Childhood Educators, which digs into the complexities, frictions, and mistrusts embedded in the interplay among preparation and education, compensation and status, and diversity and inclusion. Stacy Goffin, we're happy to have her as an editor for this series. And all of the authors, as you'll see, are external to New America, but are from, offer a lot of different perspectives from the early childhood field. The impetus for this was a post that we had the opportunity to run from Albert Watt, who was speaking earlier on this call. He authored a post for our New America Weekly called Increasing Early Childhood Teachers, Education, Compensation, and Diversity. And in his post, he asserted the need for a strategy that moves forward in tandem early childhood educators, education, compensation, and the field's workforce diversity. So following, Albert's post, Stacy, Albert, and I began talking about ways to engage other voices in that important conversation. And, really, originally Stacy's idea, the blog series was born, and it's really taken off. We started with just a short list of authors we hoped would want to participate and share their perspectives, but as the post went live, our list grew quite a bit. And many have wanted to jump in and add their own perspective. And today we've had 9 or so posts, and you can find them at the link that, you can find them on newamerica.org in our early and elementary education policy page. But the series name again is Moving Beyond False Choices for Early Childhood Educators. And while we plan to continue the blog posts again through early next year, we're also thinking about how else to engage stakeholders in this important conversation. Right now, if you are a subscriber of the Early and Elementary Ed newsletter, you'll see that we're running a survey that's intended to gather feedback on how readers are engaging so far, if they've learned anything new, what topics or perspectives they think are missing, and what are other ways that you all might want to engage, whether it's through webinars or in-person events or other ideas that you might have. So I hope you'll take a few minutes to fill that out if you're able, and I can share that link with Jana, so she can send that out perhaps in some follow-up materials, or Abby and I will be in Austin, so we can certainly give that to you next week. And then just one other plug, if you're going to stay for NEYC's PLI, we're having a session that will include a panel discussion with some of the authors from this blog series, and then we'll have small group discussions as well. So the session will be June 11th at 8 a.m. and it's called Moving Beyond False Choices for Early Childhood Educators, Untangling the Preparation and Education, Compensation and Status, and Diversity and Inclusion Knot. So look forward to any questions you have.
So thank you. We'll open it up if folks have questions of any of our speakers today. I have a couple of follow-ups to questions that we've already received. One, folks really want the direct link to both the guidebook but also the blog. So we will be sending those around along with all of the kind of documents that you've seen in the slide deck before. We will send around the links with a message to all participants on today's webinar, and we'll also put them up on our preliminary web conference under the tab for the roundtable. One question I have for you, Abby and Laura, it seems that you've taken a very complex document with very requiring a very heavy lift to look at the 13 recommendations, broken it down and provided a lot of additional resources to support someone's work. Have you known in your work with states any folks, or since the guidebook has been out in December, whether any, I could really see state policymakers or a team from a given state, or perhaps cross-state teams, kind of doing a shared inquiry within the guidebook. Has anyone broached that question with you all, or do you know some folks that are making their way piece at a time, either higher ed folks or policymakers, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's, this is Laura, and we've not heard about that request yet. We have heard a lot of people saying that this is really useful and that they are using it from both organizations and individuals. That shared inquiry sort of is how we actually got started. So we did a little New America and a couple of other organizations. We got on a webinar or video chat every like 6 weeks or so, and worked our way through the book and kind of just had a conversation about the different chapters and some questions we had and things like that. So that's how we got started. But I think that's a great idea, and we're happy to talk to any state or organization that's interested in thinking about how to do that.
So I also like that in several places, both in your table of contents in the footer, but also several places within the guidebook, you kind of give an on-ramp for start here. If you don't know where to start here. I really like that. And then also your questionnaire, and also kind of questionnaire as a strength analysis, I think is also a good starting point. It's always a good space to, start with your questions and then move on from there.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So I will highlight and actually pull that one out when we load stuff on the webinar, particularly around the questionnaire for state policymakers, which I think is very relevant for our audience and for Austin. Are there any questions? I don't have any further questions that have been posted yet, but if there are any questions or comments from the folks whose lines are open, please feel free to pipe in here. Okay, hearing none, I'm actually going to take the presentation back, Abby, from you. And let's see if I can do that quickly. And it moves us on to Q&A. There was a question in the box which I would like to pose for all. And that is, it seems that everyone who spoke today is in favor of raising the education requirements. And the big question that always kind of, raises its head is how compensation will align with that requirement, and kind of the chicken and egg question. I know that the finance panelists may have responded to that last week. Albert, I don't know if you have some easy answers there, or if anyone whose line is open has a response to that question. And not that we'll leave it there, because I think it's not, it's not quickly answered nor quickly, surpassed, but there is some emerging guidance as to how we'll get there. Albert, you still with us?
Yeah, I'm right here. So I'm thinking, I don't think there was a large group discussion about that issue in last week's meeting. There was some side conversation, kind of more small table conversations about it. I mean, I think, so one is that I think we absolutely need to one of the things I learned along the way is that we absolutely need to think about how to advance education, compensation, and diversity together. If we don't, it would just kind of assume that one will follow the other. It's not gonna, our experience have shown us that it's not really gonna happen, at least not in a meaningful way. So that said, I think that, you know, the Alliance is funding a project right now with 8 states that Sue Russo at Teach is leading, that is looking at what states can do to advance compensation policies. You know, I think a lot of the strategies that the states are working on are important, but I think even they would agree that it's still at kind of the marginal kind of level. So things like tax credits, things like, you know, wage supplements. Some people are thinking about shared services and how that can enhance maybe not compensation necessarily, but benefits. If you have a network of providers that are buying into, you know, benefit packages. Others are also thinking about how QRIS can advance compensation. I think there's some example, I can't name them right now, but I heard that there were some examples at this meeting that some states, you know, incentivize the use of salary scales for early childhood providers, so that they can get a higher rating if they implement salary scales that meet certain criteria. So I think all those are, you know, promising and necessary, but not sufficient. I think, you know, we can think about how one of the things that the financing report did not talk about, that I was a little surprised that it was the use of school funding formulas for supporting pre-K and pre-K teachers. And, you know, I know that's just one part of the workforce, but I would argue like it's important to move some part of the workforce rather than like none. So I think, you know, states where they have embedded pre-K in their school funding formula have, you know, and we have some policy research from the Center for Study of Childhood Employment and NEAR that have done some papers on pre-K parity, and some states have been able to do that, and some states have been able to do that even without the school funding formula. Like I think Alabama is one state that comes to mind where they at least have pre-K teachers in a way that mirrors the K-12 system, and maybe not exactly, you know, replicate the salary scale there, but at least mirrors it. So some of this is, you know, political leadership, political will to, you know, to change how things work and invest in these in compensation. I think we need differentiated strategies with different parts of the workforce. So infant toddler teachers for now, I think, you know, I don't think anybody is thinking about pre-K or kindergarten parity for that population of workforce. So, which doesn't say that we can't work on how to support their compensation, you know, through policy changes. I do think that will be obviously different from how you do that with pre-K teachers in most states. So thinking about this as in a differentiated kind of way, I think would be helpful.
So the other thing I would add is at the end of the joint work meeting last week among the national organization folks who developed the prospectus paper that Deb talked about, falling on the heels of the finance paper, and recognizing that there's some sticker shock. It's not surprising sticker shock. Everyone knows that kind of moving toward degrees and moving toward a more highly qualified workforce, highly competent workforce that is well compensated and well supported, as Albert said, comes up with a big number. All of those organizations that were at that meeting not only put their thumbprints on the 13 recommendations, but also agreed to stay together and to be component parts of building public will toward that final number. It will take time and definitely requires concerted effort and building that public will. But I do feel like there are folks that are, circling the wagons around that as a legitimate goal, both for its economic benefits and certainly for the benefits for our children and for the workforce itself. The other thing that I think is worth keeping an eye on is I think that NAYC's power to the profession has gotten better and better as they've gone through their decision cycles at coupling the idea of increased qualifications with increased compensation. It's difficult to kind of, play the chicken and egg game, but I think they are getting very fluent at describing how these things can move together. So keep an eye out on that. We'll point you toward that. And they also will be a part of our Austin Roundtable. So you can continue to return to the tabs and materials on our Roundtable site. I know we said that we would go till 4:30, but in point of fact, it's always good to leave extra time at the end of a meeting. If there are any other questions from either our presenters or our audience, please write or speak now. And I'll give it a moment of quiet while you might do that and move on to our final slide, which just highlights that all of the resources we showed today will be posted on our website under the preliminary webinar tab. You will find them there. And they also will be sent to all of you as participants on today's webinar. So I don't see any additional questions coming in. I'll open the mic for a minute for our other presenters and speakers on the line. Any questions, any final comments, folks?
This is Susan Sarver in Nebraska, and I wanted to follow up a little bit on this kind of chicken and egg with the bachelor's degree and the compensation, because they are so intertwined. And we've been using the analogy with some of the folks we're working with is that all of this and all of these recommendations are like a Rubik's Cube. And once you get one side solved, you feel like you're going backwards because somebody just solved a different color. So you got your red side of, bachelor's degree and, qualifications all solved, and then somebody comes along to work on funding and compensation, and they've now messed up everything you've done. And so we're really trying to think about the idea that it's all intertwined, and you may be going in spurts in one area and then in another area. And it's not just a smooth linear timeline. And we want to do that so much to move in this linear way, but I don't think this process can be that same sort of linear thinking to really do all 13 of these recommendations.
Thank you. That's actually the precise analogy that the folks from NAYC are using as well. So I do think it's a useful analogy. Sounds like somebody else was going to pipe in there.
Yeah, Jenna, it's me, Albert. And I just want to add on to, I think that's actually a really, I haven't heard that before, but it's very appropriate. I think the other thing I just want to emphasize the importance of political will and public will, and that did come up in the finance meeting last week. And thinking about what we can learn from other issues that have made significant advances, including financial investments in the past. So I think of the Affordable Care Act, which granted, there was a lot of controversy and issues related to the implementation of it. But the fact is that happened in a relatively short time with a lot of additional investments. So what can we learn from that? Both what should we do and what should we not do to move an issue? I think the other is just even right now, like all the teacher walkouts and strikes that are happening in relatively conservative states, that many of whom have suddenly found revenue resources to support K-12 education, whereas just weeks before they were like, our budget is limited and we have constraints, but when push comes to shove, there were resources to be found. so I think we need to think about how we can get early care and education to a point where that is the conversation about, we can no longer kind of move forward, and still kind of, deliver on the promise of this effort without additional investments.
Yeah, I agree. And I had a sense of the folks around the table last week, many of who have been working long and hard on these issues, that they're not giving up. And that was heartening. Not only not giving up, but they are all in on the idea that this requires it requires effort, and it requires investment, and kind of moving, twisting that Rubik's Cube is something we'll all continue to work at. So I want to thank all of the presenters today. Albert, Deb, Linda, Susan, Jim, thanks for being aboard and helping us move toward Austin. And I really appreciate all the initiatives. Laura and Abby, we're going to point folks toward your resources, and I imagine you're going to hear from people time and time again. So thank you for being with us in this puzzle.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.